Yes,
Yeah,
one
right
here.
here.
One more.
Oh,
There's
Cheryl
one
right
here.
here.
Oh, okay.
In the front,
Okay,
too.
Hi Cheryl, good to see you.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hey Cheryl. I'll behave.
I want to thank you all for coming today. We do this twice a month usually, so I've got a list of speakers for you before you leave, so you can see who else is coming. I would like to introduce Julie Decker. She's the Assistant Professor of Nursing at Mount Aloysius, and she's going to talk to us about Army nurses in Vietnam.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb, for your kind invitation to come here today on such a lovely day. It's not raining. I was driving down here and I'm like, what is that strange round heat object in the sky? I have no idea. Oh wait, it's the sun. We haven't seen it for so long. But thank you so very much for your interest in the real women who served in Vietnam. I'm sure, how many of you have read the book, The Women? Okay, so you know Kristen Hanna did a bang-up job with this book. Why Kristen Hanna did such a bang-up job with this book is that she did her homework. I don't know if you know this or not, but she consulted very closely with Diane Carlson Evans, who was the foundress of the movement to erect the Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. That's why this book is a big hitter, okay, amongst individuals. In fact, I was just talking with Diane this morning. Diane's a very good friend of my husband and I's, and she sends her gratitude to all of you present here today for honoring and supporting the nurses who served in Vietnam. So I do extend those to you.
Thank you.
So, the women of Vietnam. So as we know, the Vietnam War began as this very idealistic struggle between democracy and communism. But as the casualty count grew, the questions at home started to float to the surface as to why we were there. Is it really necessary that we were there? But sadly, the women who following along the course of history were forgotten. They were absolutely forgotten. So, more disturbingly, those nurses who, Army and Navy and Air Force nurses, this presentation is focusing on the Army nurses, their efforts were sadly forgotten. And much like as they lovingly refer to the men as their veteran brothers, they suffered the same issues and continue to that their brothers also have. So a little bit of the background of Vietnam. I'm not going to go into this at any great lengths. It's kind of interesting to give a little bit of statistical background, but really the most astonishing statistic that when you look at the background of Vietnam as it comes to the surface is that, remarkably, only 2% of the casualties who these nurses treated perished. Only 2%.
Wow.
Whoops. So a little bit more kind of funneled into the subject matter that we're here today. Depending upon the source that you look at, there were between 10 to 11,000 women who served. Of that number, about 90% of them were nurses. Okay? And the Army Nurse Corps presence began in Vietnam as early as 1956. Okay? So how did they get these girls to come in? Well, if you know anything about the nursing history of World War II, they had the Cadet Nursing Corps, okay? And with the Cadet Nursing Corps, these young ladies would sign up. They would receive a stipend from the government that would help pay for their nursing education. But in return, they were required to have 2 years of full-time service in the United States military in the Nurse Corps, whether it would have been during World War II at the time of the Army Nurse Corps or the Navy Nurse Corps. In Vietnam, it was those aforementioned branches of nursing, but also the Air Force. So the recruiting demand responsibility for nursing was through the Surgeon General's office. But with this impending need for nurses, this widespread mass advertising campaign came into being. They used journals like the American Journal of Nursing, the Nursing Outlook, RN Magazine, and Tomorrow's Nurse as the popular scholarly journals of the day for nurses, but they also reached out to Mademoiselle magazine and Glamour magazine. Now, the recruitment, and these are actual photographs of advertisements, while the recruitment materials didn't really always paint the situations quite accurately, they became as completing the final objective, and that was they depicted a unique combination of professional as well as personal rewards. It was a place where, in theory, women, we were in the 1960s and early 1970s when the war was going on, we were still delving into that equal rights movement, okay, for women. So women could find, in theory, equality while serving in the armed forces. This was a mechanism for them to receive respect, because when they went in, they were officers. They came in as second lieutenants. It was so named Operation Nightingale. And it was those usual efforts, recruitments at nursing schools. Now, at the time of the war, Vietnam War, we still had a lot of diploma nursing schools, okay, 2-year nursing programs, with which I am a very proud graduate of. That was round 1. We had 3 more after that. But anyway, so it was a lot of recruitment at nursing schools. There was a lot of recruitment on college campuses, because we did have baccalaureate programs at that time. These are some more of the Operation Nightingales. Now, are any of you here nurses? Okay, so you all understand. It's all about Florence, okay? Well, really it isn't, but there's much more to Florence. But it's all about Florence, isn't it? Now, those of you ladies here who are nurses, look at this picture. Does that not state Florence Nightingale? The lady with the lamp, okay? That's Florence's mantra, amongst many other ones. But look at this. Then, on and off duty, it kind of romanticizes the opportunities of being a nurse, as well as the opportunities for the off-duty times. Appealing? More than likely, yes, it was, and it worked, because 60% of the Army nurses who went to Vietnam, 60%, okay, had less than 6 years of experience. Most of them had less than 2 years of experience. And the majority, the small majority, had less than 6 months of experience.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So who were they? Well, 70% of them, and in some cases you could find a statistic that will tell you 80% were females. Average age was 23 years old. They hailed from white, working class Catholic families, many of whom were either daughters or granddaughters of veterans of the 2 previous world wars. But as I said, many of them lacked any type of nursing experience. Now think about those days when we were all a little still wet behind ears, as they say. okay, and being thrown into the abyss that we're gently going to talk about. I like to use a lot of quotes, and just because it makes it more realistic. A nurse who served with the 91st EVAC hospital in a place called July remarked, quote, "I hated the Army for not preparing me better, but then again, I don't think it was possible to train anyone to experience something that horrible without having them to simply just live it." End quote. Things a little goofy. Why did they go? Well, there were a sundry of reasons why they went. Pay for nursing school, to see the world, to get out from underneath the thumb of their overprotective parents, and engage and embrace that sense of adventure that many young people have. Some of the parents were horrified that their daughters were going into a combat zone. Aside from the concern of being in a combat zone, some parents believed that women who joined the military were of low moral character. That was a theme that came across. It is impossible, though, to note, as those of us who grew up during this very turbulent time in our country, it's impossible to know how many of these nurses carried the anti-war sentiment with them. They carried it with them, some of them did. However, their commitment to the profession of nursing superseded any political ideology that they had. Another nurse summed service up in this way. And then there was the Kennedy thing. What you can do for your country. I was part of that era. This is a nurse speaking. And part of that generation, and I thought, well, this is perfect. I can serve my country. I can express my feelings about the war. I can get out of New York. And there was lots of adventure. Plus, it pays for the last year of nursing school. End quote. For these nurses, the emphasis always was to help save lives. That was their primary focus. One nurse who did express her opposition to the war conveyed that she became very political after her aunt's paper boy joined the service and had perished in Vietnam. That is what brought her to wanting to join the military to help save lives and preserve lives. So their training is very simplistic. 6 weeks training at Fort Sam Houston. They were introduced to a mock Vietnamese village, and they learned about basic drills and emergency room and triage concepts. That was it.
Oh, wow.
6 months training.
6 weeks.
Or 6 weeks, I'm sorry. 6 weeks training.
Wow.
Excuse me, thank you. So, packed their belongings, and they went. And the majority of troops arrived, as did the ladies, at a airport called Benoit. And to further add to the stress, they were on average very large airliners, and there may have only been 1 to 3 females on that airliner. The rest were troops, like them, coming into Vietnam. One nurse recalled of the flight, quote, we were not far off the coast of Vietnam, and the captain announced that the enemy was mortaring the airfield. And we were to land at that same airfield. The plane made a steep landing. They opened the door. We ran out to the bunker, and before we left, the individual standing at the exit door said, "Welcome to Vietnam, ma'am. Put your head down and good luck." So upon that, what's interesting to add, the males who were on the airplane, and you see Pan American was the big transport company, the men who were on the plane were dressed in their fatigues. The women, however, needed to be in dress
Oh,
uniforms.
she's hose and everything.
Hose,
High
white
heels.
gloves, high heels, purse. You got the whole picture.
Oh my gosh.
You got the whole picture. Yes, 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 yes. So when they arrived in their dress uniforms, they and why they did that was the Army mandated that they had to be neat and offer a professional appearance. Okay?
Were they all officers?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Diane Carlson Evans, which I just spoke about, my friend said that, and quote, nobody talked on the plane going over. It was dead silence. My biggest feeling was a huge sense of anxiety. I didn't know enough when I had to face casualties. I had a fear of not measuring up. The reality of the combat zone hit me the minute the plane landed. Because you see, they were escorted off the plane. In Diane's case, it was dark, and there were 2 guards out on the tarmac, and they said, nurses out first. And on the steps down, I saw the guard who was wearing bandoliers and carried huge weapons. One guard took us to a bus that the windows were painted black, and there were chicken wires over the windows of the bus. That was to prevent any type of rockets or grenades from the enemy being thrown into the bus. And Candace Sullivan, who was another nurse, described the moment she landed in Vietnam, and I use her words, quote, absolute terror. So their living conditions, they lived in Quonset huts or some in tents. They called them hooches. There were a few creature comforts at home. They oftentimes requested from home female products to be sent because the PXs were not equipped for it. But the PX had an overloading of nylons. Now, you're in a combat zone. Who the heck needs nylons, right? No, but bathrooms were limited for women. They lived under and worked through mortar and rocket attacks, as well as the infiltration of the Viet Cong. In August of 1969, the enemy attacked the 6th Army Convalescent Hospital, where 2 patients lost their lives and 99 wounded, and then later another attack occurred at a place called Can Run Bay. Nurses were on duty during the attacks, protected their patients first. The patients came first, always. And how did they protect them? They drugged them underneath the mattresses in the hospital. If they were unable to be removed from the bed for whatever reasons, they would put mattresses on top of them. But this is what else they did. They used themselves as human shields. Their patients always came first. Their brothers came first. They were willing to sacrifice their very life for their brothers. Diane again adds, you also became keenly aware of sound. You could tell with whether it was incoming rocketry or it was outgoing rockets, really by just the sound. Helicopters. Helicopters had 2 impressions. For those who were injured and in the field, the helicopter was interpreted as a lifeboat. But for the nurses, the sound of that helicopter meant they had to come and go to work. And again, there's a nice little bit of a segue there about the helicopters. Helicopters were used in the Korean War. If you watch MASH, I think I've seen every episode of MASH at least 10 times. I learn something new every time. Not just Hot Lips and Frank, but you know. But this use of helicopters for rescue was introduced predominantly during the Korean War. And as I said, quick response and transport. I read a statistic once, and I'm trying to conjure it up here. Something to the effect that from the time of the injury that occurred to an individual in Vietnam until they reached a hospital was less than a half an hour. It was very quick. Now, you were coming up on the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, so comparatively speaking, we had these things called horses. But that could have been days. So, as tragic as war always is, the medical community and medical advancements always benefit. And this was one of them. This was absolutely one of them. So this is nothing more than just a little map to show you where all of the different hospitals were located throughout the country of Vietnam. Yes, we used that concept throughout this that was invented in the Civil War, well, attributed to Jonathan Letterman, and actually was a French surgeon who did this, but this concept of calling triage that we still use today. Letterman just kind of refined it and then tweaked in the ambulance corps, okay? But medic in the field was the first line of treatment. Then the medevac to the nearest hospital, and then there could have been, if they could not stabilize them or there were other issues going on, they would have evacuated them to a rear hospital or to a medical naval ship, the USS Sanctuary, the USS Repose. And then to Japan or the Philippines, and then they came home to places like Walter Reed, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, for those who were there. So, as I said, most of these hospitals were in heavy combat zones. And probably the heaviest ones were the 71st EVAC, who was located in Pleiku and Long Binh, Chu Chai, and other hospitals located throughout the country of Vietnam. So, life of a combat nurse. Well, it was in essence a 12-month rotation, unless they re-upped or maybe sometimes had to stay 14, 15 months. They worked 12 hours shifts, 6 days a week, unless it was a time of mass casualties. Then everything was off. You worked until those patients were taken care of. They dealt with these rare diseases that they only learned about in nursing school. So a couple of them, was reading, they were glad they took their books from nursing school because there were these weird diseases that never happened in this country and they didn't really know how to take care of them. They suffered frequent rocket and sapper attacks, okay? We're gonna talk about those in a little bit here. But they frequently lived under stress, constantly. And those sappers, were Viet Cong, were sympathizers of the Viet Cong philosophy who would infiltrate into the bases and into the hospitals. And they would act as snipers. They were also known to plant explosives within the hospital perimeter. Not all of these sappers, you would think, were male. The majority of them were, but there were also females who would infiltrate the hospitals and the camps. And they would act as maids or mama sons. Now, yes, the majority of them did not carry that mindset. But there was a small percentile that did. In fact, they found a mama son who was planting explosives in and around the hospital. They did thankfully catch it, diffused it, and everything was okay. But on the other hand, those who were not sympathetic to the Viet Cong and were working for, in particular, the Army nurses, they would hear the chatter and they would alert the bases of an incoming rocket attack or some type of some type of a covert action. So they did save a lot of lives, these maids and these mama sons did. But as the war progressed, many nurses started to become very numb. Think about that. You know, our humanness, as strong as nurses are, we all nurses in the room here, we know how we are, okay? It's that compensatory, I think, shield that we drop. I worked in ICU for 20 years, okay, at the bedside, 20 years straight. When I think about that, I'm like, holy cow. But we have to sometimes put up our defense mechanisms. But then again, that's 20 years that I spent at the bedside. I lived under the threat of nobody shooting rockets into my hospital where I was working. But some of them did. Some of them became very numb to the situation. As I said before, many nurses came unprepared. Okay, whether with their training at Fort Sam or just being so young and so new out of nursing school. They weren't prepared for what they saw. They called it baptism by fire for new nurses. This is Maureen Aducci, and I use her quote a lot because I think it really ties it all together. It was a distressing aspect that one nurse recalled that we called them all babies because they were our age or younger. They could have been our brothers. They could have been our cousins. They could have been our boyfriends. They could have been husbands. That is who they cared for. And there was really no way for them to be prepared for what they saw. Maureen worked in a trauma unit. Now that in New York, I believe it was. Yeah, she was at Bellevue. So she worked in a trauma unit, but what she saw in that trauma unit was nothing compared to what she saw in Vietnam. Nothing. Normally, you know, a lot of those things, they had to learn about triaging. Those memories linger to this day. To this day. I've had the privilege, the profound privilege, and the profound honor to know many, many nurses who have served in Vietnam. And in a time, I think, when we attach that word, the adjective hero, I feel it's misaligned. These are my heroes. And I tell my nursing students about them a lot. And I talk to them a lot about these women. And I am so pleased that their story, albeit in a fiction book, has been told. It needs to be told. It should have been told a very long time ago. The triage facility, the triage philosophy was that you do the most good for the most people in the time that you have allotted. So where this comes into play and why it was difficult that many of these nurses, particularly the ER nurses and those who were assigned to triage, had that they played God. And they decided who was going to go first and who was not, who had to wait. And then we had the category of what was called the expected. And we're going to talk about those folks in just a little bit. But this is another quote of Maureen's that I really, really use a lot. She's describing working in times of mass casualties, okay? And this is her quote. Unbelievable. I handled huge car accidents and gunshot wounds in the States, and I felt I could handle anything. But to see this never-ending line of wounded lined up outside the door was just unbelievable. We worked and worked for 24 hours straight, and into obviously the new day. When it was over, we hosed down the floor of the OR, and that was my first day in Vietnam. She did not even get processed, okay, with the commanding officer. She was telling me this story. She said, the commanding officer said, Aducci, Lieutenant Aducci, yes ma'am. You're no earners, yes ma'am, come with me. Let your stuff in my office. So she left, she said scrub in, and that was her first day. That was her first day in Vietnam. But nurses had multiple roles. They were on call, essentially, 24/7. One day off if they were lucky, but they really never had a day off. And I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. But their roles were, they were mothers. They were mothers to the wounded. They were sisters. They were girlfriends. They were wives. They were the girl next door. They took on multiple roles. Helen White said at one point in time that she was told after she had a loss of a very young soldier. She was told, Lieutenant, go put your lipstick on, dry your eyes, and go back to work. Diane Carlson Evans recalled, this is such a poignant story, that she recalled a young soldier that came into her hospital. His name was Eddie Lee Evans. And his first rounds of wounds were very minor, but they left him there for a while. He was a great help to them. He, helped mop the floors and brought cheer to the soldiers and so on and so forth. And like Diane, he came from Minnesota. So they had a great connection. And the way she was describing this to me, they really had a strong connection. The time for his discharge from the hospital came, and they sent him back. And before he left, he asked if it would be okay if he wrote Diane. And she said, my gosh, absolutely. But she said, a couple weeks later, she wrote him a letter, but she never got a letter back. One day after that, she received a large manila envelope with a string on it, and she opened it, and she found his letter to him. Where you see his commanding officer sent her a message in that envelope that Eddie was killed, and her letter to him was found in his shirt pocket. She said at that point in time is when I didn't want to know what happened to my soldiers. I didn't want to know. So the days off that they had, many spent time in med caps. Med caps were going to the local orphanages to teach mothers about, Vietnamese mothers, about baby care. They would be there to offer some fundamental first aid, giving vaccinations, assessing the children. That was their, if you will, their relief, because they were now surrounded by younger children. And as we all know, young children always bring smiles to our faces. But when they went back, there were children who were missing and had passed away. So they carried with them, and to this day, still carry with them, a lot of internal conflicts. the enormity of the casualties with which they witnessed. They had to make the life and death decisions, oftentimes. They felt as if they were playing God. And the task of telling a young patient that he had lost a leg or an arm or more than that, they were caring for the enemies as well. Now, they were in a separate ward, but they also had to take care of their enemies. And you know, one of these stories that, again, I like to tell, there was a nurse who was serving in July who found herself having to take care of a North Vietnamese Army POW who was involved in directly involved in the death of 6 American soldiers. This was her quote as she described it. When this guy was wheeled into my ward, I was so filled with rage that something snapped within me. And it filled me with uncontrollable feelings of rage and hate. Another nurse commented that after working on an entire helicopter crew only to lose them all, I was forced to receive the 2 enemy soldiers who had just gunned down the helicopter. I was so filled with rage that I attacked one of them and I was starting to strangle him with my bare hands, with every intent to kill him. This nurse had to be knocked unconscious by one of the medics in the hospital for her to release her grasp. Now I'm going to take you back to the early beginning of this program, or of this presentation. 23 years old was their average age. She said, you know, it left me very shaken because I realized that, again, for the nurses in the audience, I realized I have violated that very sacred pledge that I took when I became a nurse. And that is what we call the Nightingale Pledge. And in that pledge it says, willingly and knowingly do no harm to our patients. So coming home was different than in wars past. I know some World War II, a fair amount of World War II veterans who unfortunately have passed on, but one of the themes, there was with this one, have any of you ever watched The Band of Brothers?
Yes.
Okay, Bill Garnier, they called him gonorrhea. Okay, well, Bill was a friend of ours who loved my daughter. My daughter has red hair and blue eyes. She's very Irish looking, and Bill always used to say to me, you know, Joel, if I was only 70 years younger. And I said, no, I don't think so. Well, why not? And I said, I know you South Philly boys too well. But, you know, Bill told me, he said, and I'm quoting Bill, hell, Joel, I didn't buy a beer for 5 years after I came home. This didn't happen to our Vietnam men and women who served. They left a country that was percolating in a great division. They came home to a country that was fiercely divided. And knowing the number of Vietnam veterans with whom I have the honor of knowing, the same as the World War II veterans, they came home to horrible conditions. They were spat at. They were called awful, horrendous names. They had balloons at the airports that was filled with human excrement thrown at them. Okay? We were a very sharply divided country at that time. The nurses were looking forward to what they called their freedom bird. That was to bring them back to this country. They heard tenets of this philosophy in the mail that they had gotten from their families, but they never experienced it until they got here. To the degree, now these nurses wore a caduceus, and it had an N on it, meaning that they were nurses. They were treated the same way as their brothers. To the extent that, and if any of you have ever been in the military, it is an extraordinarily, must be, an extraordinarily proud thing to put that dress uniform on, or any uniform. They were told, don't wear them in this country. But when you land in the United States, you make sure you have civilian clothes on. Sad, very tragic, but true. When the nurses left, they had a lot of difficulty because they didn't know what happened to their patients. Okay? They felt, and this is one of these central tenets of nursing, you never abandon your patients. Never. But they didn't know what happened to them. They didn't know where they went or if they were able to go. So complicating, as I said, the issues with coming home were the widespread college campus protests, the national protests, Washington, D.C., and this just did not set well with them. A nurse I quote, said, "You mean I spent a hellish year in the midst of war caring for my brother soldiers' wounds, and now I come home safe, but I'm at risk because of my service to this country." Edie Meeks, who is another friend of ours from the Vietnam War, recalled, "When I got home, everyone expected me to be the same person who I was when I left. No. I don't know how a human can go through that, a nurse in particular, and not come home a changed person." So they had post-readjustment issues coming home. They sensed the great lack of interest that a portion of the American public had. They didn't want to hear about it. There was a sense that women were not true veterans. Oh yes, that is very true. The veteran service organizations, the American Legion, the VFW, did not recognize Vietnam veterans or Vietnam nurses or females as being individuals who served in combat or served in the military. Professionally and occupational challenges. Some of them tried to go back into nursing, but they found it was a whole different world. In the civilian nursing sector, it was more so you followed the order of the physician. Okay? In Vietnam, they had carte blanche. I recall I think it was a nurse, it was an interview, it was not something I had read, that during the time of many casualties, okay, she had a patient, it was an OR nurse, who had a patient who needed their spleen removed. The doctor didn't have time to remove the spleen. There was not enough time, there were too many ill. So what this doctor did, he switched the OR tables and talked her through removing the spleen. And the patient went home. This is the power of nursing. And this is the power and the very proud legacy that these women have. They, like their brothers, they dealt with the PTSD. Now, we didn't have those initials yet. That didn't come till the 80s. Shell shock, exactly. It wasn't recognized. As a matter of fact, a good friend of my husband and I's was just telling us this story that she went to the VA. Oh yeah, that's something else I forgot to tell you. The VA, they want to deal with the women when they come back from Vietnam. They don't want to deal with them. In fact, Kate told my husband and I the story that her PTSD had gotten the best of her. It had caused major damage to her marriage, okay? And she could no longer practice as a nurse. Her triggers, those things that brought that PTSD to the surface, had gotten the best of her. went to the VA and had a counselor. And the counselor was a former Marine, and she went in and she started to talk to him about her concerns. His reply to her was this, and I quote, "You are nothing more than a wannabe," end quote. Now, Kate is a little taller than I, and Kate went up and she put both of her hands around his neck, brought him right to her face, and said to him, quote, "Don't you ever minimize my service as a nurse in Vietnam," and gave him a little shove and put him in the chair and walked out. Now, if you would know Kate, you would never believe that she would say that. She's about as soft-spoken as it comes, but it happened. It happened. So they dealt with the insensitivity. Professionally and occupationally, they were not recognized for what they knew. In Vietnam, they would hang blood. The nurses would hang blood. They could give medications. Back home, they had to call the physician to give the patient an aspirin. Talk about an insult. Talk about an insult. But in 1982, the mindset of the country changed. We were ready to come together again about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam Wall was dedicated in 1982, and amongst over 58,000 names who were on that wall, there are 8 nurses who died during their service in Vietnam. One of those 8 is officially listed as a killed in action, and that is Sharon Lane. She was from Canton, Ohio, and she is memorialized at the hospital where she went to nursing school with a lovely statue of her. That's the Vietnam Wall, but what about the women? What about the nurses? Other than the 8 who perished during their service there. Well, enter the Vietnam Women's Memorial Project. Was incorporated in 1984. The purpose of this was to promote recognition and healing for the women who served in Vietnam. Now, a little bit about this monument. Has anybody ever seen it? Okay. One thing that you notice is that none of the 3 women have ranks. Okay? None of them wear distinctive patches or things that indicate, were they nurses, were they dietitians, were they wax, were they secretary. That was not the intent. It was to honor, it was just not the nurses' memorial, although it's commonly referred to as that. It was to honor all women who served in Vietnam. And it took 10 years for my friend Diane to get this off the ground. And believe you me, it was a challenge. The Fine Arts Commission turned her proposal down. They said, well, you know, you have the wall there. She said, yes, that is for all of those who did not come home. But you also have the statue of the 3 men there. That represents everybody who served in Vietnam. She said, no, it doesn't. But what about the women? They actually told her that they were going to push this behind because they wanted to erect a statue to honor the service dogs. Now, let me do the disclaimer. I should have done this beforehand. I love dogs. Okay, I love big dogs, like Great Danes and Mastiffs and the big fellas. And I'm not undermining the role of the dogs. Must have been an all-men committee. Really? Yeah, it must have been. But really. So, after a 10-year battle, this is what my very brave friend stood up in front of the committee and said. And this is all she said. She had to testify in front of various agencies. Is not the selfless service of 265,000 women, all volunteers? Oh yes, we don't draft women, who served during the Vietnam era around the world. 10,000 of them, the majority of whom were nurses in Vietnam under grave and life-threatening conditions, saving the lives of 350,000 American soldiers, of the greatest historical significance and worthy of this nation's eternal gratitude. And with that, she sat down. The vote was unanimous to permit them to dedicate this monument. So the day finally came, and it was a glorious one as it was. The sun was shining that day. Congressional legislation and approval was done. The dedication of the monument encompassed a 3-day celebration, November 10th through the 12th of 1993 in Washington, D.C. And I call it, I don't mean it's just what I call it, it is what I call the sacred triangle. You stand at this memorial and you look in front of you, maybe about 11 o'clock to one's left, and you see the V wing of the wall. But you also look to your left, and there are the statue of the 3 infantrymen. I call it the sacred triangle. I don't know what other people call it, but thousands of Vietnam veterans, their families and their friends joined the nation as the nurses, the women of Vietnam, were honored. This was one of those times of immense healing. To listen to these nurses who were there on that very sacred day, they will tell you that they walked by hospitals to the sculpture, and they will tell you, that Vietnam veterans, would yell out from the crowd, "Second Surge, you were my nurse. 71st evac, you were my nurse." Could you imagine that? Could you imagine that? What that must have been like. But inseparable friends, Edie Meeks and Diane Carlson Evans, as I said, are both friends of ours. These two are inseparable friends. They live across the country from each other. They were hooch mates in Vietnam. Now, Edie, if you see, Diane's, I think, about as tall as I am. Edie's probably about this big. And my husband is close to 6 feet tall. And Edie absolutely loves my husband. And my husband loves Edie. And when they see each other, it's, it's just like the joining, and Diane as well, as long lost friends. But they recall the day that the dedication of the monument by this quote. This was Edie. "We wondered after all those years if we did a good job. They came out of the woodwork," they being the Vietnam veterans, "from all across the country. They were walking, they were walking with crutches and wheeling their wheelchairs and doing their wheelies like they used to in the hospitals with us. They wanted to find a nurse who took care of them because they simply wanted to say, thank you." These are pictures, and I would be very remiss if I did not put a tribute up here to these women who passed away. This young lady is Sharon Lane, and this is Mary Therese Klinker. I don't know if you saw, I think it was last week, 2 weeks ago, CBS News did a special on Operation Baby Lift, where they took the Amerasian children and brought them to the United States. Sadly, on one of the last missions before Da Nang fell, they had a airplane full of babies and young children, and Mary Therese Klinker was on that plane, and it went down shortly after being taking off. Now, she did perish, but many children did survive. Many children did survive. It's a story. It's a story. And it's something that we really need to think about. So today, a memorial to the women who served and died in Vietnam stands proudly near the wall whose names they cared for in death, and along with the bronze statue portraying the men who they helped to come home. Women were with them in the war 32 years ago. They took their rightful place finally amongst their comrades. It is essential to this day that these women know that what they did mattered. It is essential that all these years, 50 years after the war, we just commemorated that, there is a special place for them too, on very, very hallowed ground. So in the end, I will leave you with this. A paraphrase in the words of C.S. Lewis that I think is really quite apropos for some of these ladies. This is only a smattering of them. I use and alter minimally C.S. Lewis's words, in that it is most likely that we shall meet cruel enemies, but also let us at least have heard of bravery and heroic courage. And the pictures of these ladies, all of whom are friends of ours, just some of them, I don't have some of all of them, I can't put them all out there, it'd be a series of slides. But it was, and is, and continues to be heroic bravery. I had the honor about 5 years ago on Memorial Day, Veterans Day, to deliver one of the keynotes at that monument. And I will tell you very personally, to be given that profound gift to stand in front of your heroes is something I will treasure to the end of time. But I'll leave you with the same words that I left with them. You have read about Frankie, haven't you? In Kristen's book. It tells their story. But please remember this. As long as you, and these were my words, and I'm going to put them out to you. This is your charge today. As long as you are able to take a breath, please talk about them. Please tell their stories. Never should their stories be relegated to a corner somewhere. They must remain living and breathing, because this is what this country is all about. And for those of us who are nurses, we even have a deeper responsibility to tell their stories, because they've made nursing really what it is. So thank you for your interest.